David Carter had never heard of Hollow Creek before. It wasn't on any major maps, barely a dot in the middle of nowhere, but when he landed a lucrative work contract in a nearby city, he decided to settle in the quiet little town. A fresh start, he thought. Away from the noise, away from the chaos. But as soon as he drove through its fog-covered streets, a creeping unease slithered down his spine. Hollow Creek felt off. The town was eerily pristine, the streets unusually empty. The houses, though well-maintained, looked aged beyond their years, like they had stood there for centuries, untouched by time. The air was thick, too still, as if the whole place was holding its breath. And the people. They watched him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss out on more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this story with those who need to hear it. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. See you in the next exciting and meaningful story. Not openly, but from behind curtains, from darkened doorways. Eyes that tracked his every move, studying him like he didn't belong. David tried to ignore it. He had lived in predominantly white neighborhoods before. He was used to the stares, the whispered conversations when he passed by. But this was different. This wasn't just curiosity. This was something else. Something darker. His new home was a modest, yet comfortable house at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was one of the few properties with no signs of disrepair. The previous owner had sold it cheaply and quickly, almost too quickly, and David hadn't questioned it at the time. Now, as he stood in his driveway, looking around at the seemingly abandoned houses nearby, he wondered if he should have. Then there was his neighbor. Susan Miller lived in the house right next to his. She was an older woman with hollow cheekbones, icy blue eyes, and a presence that made his skin crawl. She never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was slow, deliberate, as if she were choosing her words with extreme care. "You shouldn't be here," she had told him on his first day, her tone flat, almost detached. David had chuckled awkwardly. "Well, I signed the deed, so I guess I am." She didn't laugh. That was the first red flag. At first, her behavior was just unsettling, strange but harmless. She would stand in her yard at night, staring at his house for long stretches of time, her face barely visible through the thick evening mist. Other times, she would appear out of nowhere, watching him from across the street, never saying a word. Then things started getting weirder. Footsteps echoed outside his house late at night, crunching against the gravel, but whenever he checked, no one was there. The lights in his home flickered unpredictably, and the air inside seemed unnaturally cold, even when the heater was on full blast. One morning, he woke up to find strange symbols carved into his front door, deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there the night before. The final straw came when he found his own car keys lying in the middle of his driveway, despite the fact that he had left them on his kitchen counter the night before. His heart pounded as he picked them up, scanning the empty street, his breath fogging up in the crisp morning air. Someone had been inside his house, and David was starting to realize that in Hollow Creek he wasn't just an outsider. He was prey. The unease settled in slowly, like a shadow creeping in at dusk. At first, David chalked it up to paranoia. Moving to a new town, especially one as eerily quiet as Hollow Creek, could make anyone's nerves act up. But the signs kept piling up, one after another, until ignoring them was no longer an option. Every night, without fail, he felt eyes on him. Whether he was inside his house, outside on the porch, or even just passing by his living room window, he could feel it. The cold, prickling sensation of being watched. And every time he turned his head, there she was. Susan Miller. She never hid, never tried to be discreet. If anything, she wanted him to see her. She would stand perfectly still in her front yard, her face barely visible in the thick evening mist, her icy blue eyes locked on his house like she was waiting for something. Other times, he would catch her standing at her window, staring at him with that same expression. Blank, unreadable, but deeply unsettling. At first, David tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just an eccentric old woman, someone who had lived alone for too long and didn't know how to interact with new people. But then the disturbances started. It began with the noises. Every night around 3 a.m., he would hear footsteps crunching outside his house. Slow, deliberate steps circling the property. But when he looked outside, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. The first few times, he convinced himself it was just animals, maybe a stray dog or a coyote. But deep down, he knew the steps were too controlled, too human. Then came the scratches. One morning, he stepped out onto his porch and saw deep, jagged marks running along his front door. Not the kind made by a knife or a key, these were rougher, erratic, like they had been made by fingernails or claws. His stomach twisted at the thought. By the end of the week, the scratches had spread. They weren't just on his door anymore. They were on his windows. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. The breaking point came when he found his car door open one morning. The driver's seat had been pushed all the way back, as if someone much taller had sat there. But the worst part, his rear-view mirror had been turned to face the back seat, like someone had been sitting there. David's pulse pounded as he scanned the empty street, his breath coming out in quick, sharp bursts. There was no way he had left his car like that. No way. That night, he decided to test a theory. He left his phone camera recording in his living room, facing the front door. If someone was breaking in, or worse, if Susan was somehow getting inside, he wanted proof. At 3:07 a.m., the motion sensor on his phone activated. The next morning, with his stomach in knots, he checked the footage. At first, there was nothing. Just his quiet living room. The dim glow of the streetlight outside barely illuminating the furniture. But then, at 3:09 a.m., the front door handle turned. Not quickly, not forcefully. Slowly, deliberately. The door never opened, it was locked, but whoever was outside had stayed there for a full 5 minutes, just standing there, gripping the handle, as if waiting for something. And then, right before the motion sensor turned off, something pressed against the peephole. A pale, wide eye. David dropped the phone, his heart hammering. He knew that eye. Susan, and she had been right outside his door. David had always believed in handling things rationally. He wasn't the kind to jump to conclusions, to assume the worst. But after watching that eye staring through his peephole at 3 a.m., something inside him snapped. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. This wasn't just an old woman acting strangely. This was something else. The moment the sun rose, David called a local contractor. By noon, they were already working on installing a massive iron gate at the entrance to his driveway. It was heavy, reinforced steel with a padlock strong enough to withstand a battering ram. He didn't care if it looked excessive. He didn't care if the neighbors whispered about it. Susan wasn't getting near his house again. As the workers bolted the final hinges into place, David stood by his porch, watching them, his skin still crawling from the events of the night before. He could still see that eye in his mind, wide, cold, staring. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, Susan appeared. She was standing by her front yard, motionless, watching the workers install the gate. Her head was slightly tilted, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. David swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists. Don't engage. Don't give her the satisfaction. But Susan had other plans. You shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice carrying easily across the yard, despite how softly she spoke. David ignored her. He turned to the workers, thanking them as they packed up their tools. You think a gate will keep you safe? Susan continued, taking a slow step forward. That's not how it works here. A chill ran down his spine. How what works? He asked before he could stop himself. Susan smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, or even a mocking one. It was wrong. A slow, stretched grin that never quite reached her lifeless blue eyes. You'll see, she murmured before turning and walking away, vanishing into the mist that always seemed to hang just a little too thick around her house. That night, the knocking started. Not on the door, not on the windows, on the gate. At exactly 3 a.m., a single rhythmic knock-knock-knock echoed through the cold night air. David sat upright in bed, heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at his phone, debating whether to check the security camera feed or just pretend he hadn't heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Nope. Hell no. Grabbing his phone, he opened the app connected to his front gate camera. The screen flickered to life. And there she was, Susan, standing just outside the gate, her hands at her sides, staring directly into the camera. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her mouth slightly open as if whispering something. But the worst part, she wasn't alone. Behind her, half shrouded in the mist, were figures. Tall, thin, motionless shadows standing just beyond the reach of the gate's floodlight. Their faces were obscured, but David could feel their eyes on him. A deep, gut-wrenching terror gripped him. He knew, without a doubt, that if that gate hadn't been there, if he hadn't put up that barrier between them, they would already be inside. And Susan. She simply lifted her hand, pressed it against the gate, and whispered something. The camera glitched, then the screen went black. David barely slept that night. Even after the camera went black, he sat awake in his bed, clutching his phone like a lifeline, staring at the locked bedroom door as if at any moment something or someone would come through it. By morning, the figures were gone. So was Susan. But the feeling remained. The town had never felt normal, but now it felt wrong in a way David couldn't quite put into words. The air was heavier, the silence more suffocating. It was like Hollow Creek itself was aware of what had happened last night. Determined to get answers, David went straight to his gate first thing in the morning. The metal was ice-cold to the touch, despite the early sun already warming the rest of the street. But the most disturbing part was Susan's handprint, still visible from where she had pressed her palm against the iron. It wasn't just a handprint. The metal where she had touched it was blackened, scorched, as if something had burned through it. David's stomach turned. Before he could process it, the sound of footsteps behind him made him whirl around. 2 police officers. They were standing at the edge of his driveway, their expressions unreadable, their hands resting on their belts. "Mr. Carter," one of them asked. His badge read, "Officer Reynolds. We need to have a word with you." David felt his pulse spike. "What's this about?" Reynolds exchanged a glance with his partner. "Your neighbor, Susan Miller, called us this morning. She says you've been acting aggressively toward her, harassing her." David stared at them in disbelief. "You're kidding me." Reynolds' face remained stone cold. "She claims you threatened her last night. She says she heard you banging on her door, shouting things at her." David's breath caught in his throat. "That's not possible. I was inside my house all night. I have security footage that'll prove it." Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "That's the thing, Mr. Carter. She claims you tampered with the footage. And the rest of your neighbors say they saw you outside your house last night. They saw you standing by the gate, staring at her house." David's blood ran cold. No, that wasn't possible. He hadn't stepped outside. He knew he hadn't. He had been inside, watching Susan through the camera. Unless that hadn't been Susan at the gate. Unless that hadn't been her at all. "I wasn't outside," David said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "You can check the footage yourself." Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We will. But in the meantime, we need you to come down to the station for some questions." David opened his mouth to argue, but he stopped. Something in Reynolds' expression wasn't right. It wasn't just official, it was expectant. Like he was waiting for David to resist. Like he already knew how this would play out. The air grew thicker around him. The morning sun felt duller, and as David's eyes flickered past the officers toward Susan's house, he saw her standing there, watching. Her lips curled into the faintest of smiles, and in that moment, David knew. This wasn't about the law, this was about Hollow Creek, and it was trying to get rid of him. Sitting in the dimly lit police station, David could feel the weight of the town pressing down on him. The walls felt too close, the air too thin. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, buzzing like a swarm of invisible insects. Officer Reynolds sat across from him, his fingers lazily tapping against the desk. His partner, Officer Briggs, stood by the door, arms crossed, watching David like a predator studying its prey. "You want to tell us what really happened last night?" Reynolds asked, voice calm but edged with something unspoken. "I told you," David said, his patience fraying. "I was inside my house. I have security footage. If you let me show you, you'll see." Reynolds shook his head. "Thing is, Carter, the footage you sent us, it's corrupted. Just static." David's stomach dropped. "That's not possible." It was working fine when I checked this morning, he argued. Was it? Reynolds leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Because here's the problem. We have 3 different neighbors saying they saw you outside your house last night, pacing by your gate, staring at Susan's house. I wasn't outside, David snapped, anger overtaking fear. And you know it. Reynolds only smiled. Do we? The room felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, like the entire station was breathing around him. He felt dizzy, disoriented. The officers' faces blurred at the edges just for a second, like a mirage. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this town. You've only been here a few weeks, haven't you? Reynolds continued. Not long, but long enough to cause trouble. David clenched his fists. I haven't caused anything. I moved in. I minded my business. It's Susan who's been harassing me. Reynolds chuckled, like David had said something amusing. Susan's lived here all her life. She's a respected member of this community. You're an outsider, Carter, and outsiders don't usually last long here. There it was, the quiet threat beneath the words. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to get out of here. I want a lawyer, he said, voice even. Reynolds tilted his head slightly, then sighed. You're not under arrest, Carter, just a friendly chat. David didn't believe that for a second. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Briggs, then stood. Fine, you're free to go. But I'd be careful if I were you. Some places just don't take well to strangers. David didn't waste time leaving. The second he was outside, he sucked in a lungful of cold air, steadying himself. He needed to understand what was happening, and he knew exactly where to start. The Hollow Creek Historical Society was located in an old, weathered building near the center of town. It smelled of dust and decayed paper, the kind of place that had been forgotten by time. The receptionist, an elderly woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, barely looked up when David entered. I need records on Susan Miller, he said, keeping his voice steady. And anything about the history of my house. The woman hesitated, her fingers tightening around the book she was holding. You shouldn't be digging, she murmured. Why? She finally looked up at him, and in her eyes David saw something unexpected. Fear. Because people who dig don't find what they're looking for, she whispered. They find what's looking for them. A chill raced down his spine, but he didn't stop. 2 hours later, sitting in a dim corner of the archives, David found the first photograph. It was old, at least 100 years. Faded, yellowed at the edges. It showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like a church, dressed in outdated clothing. His fingers trembled as he traced the faces, and then he saw her, Susan Miller. She was in the photo, and she looked exactly the same. No aging, no difference. As if she had been frozen in time. David's breath came short and fast. He flipped through more records, searching, scanning, and then he found the missing persons reports. People who had moved to Hollow Creek over the past century. People who had mysteriously disappeared. Every single one of them was an outsider. Just like him. David's fingers trembled as he flipped through the brittle pages of the archive book. The more he read, the more the realization sank in, tightening around his chest like a vice. The town of Hollow Creek had a pattern, a dark, horrifying pattern that spanned over 100 years. Every few decades, a new resident would move in, an outsider, someone not connected to the town's long-standing families, someone different. And within months, sometimes even weeks, they would simply disappear. No records of them leaving, no traces of where they went. Just gone. The missing persons reports all said the same thing. Vanished without a trace. No investigations, no media coverage, no justice. And then there was Susan Miller. She had lived in Hollow Creek for over a century. She had been present in every generation when someone disappeared. Yet she never changed. Her face, her cold, unblinking eyes, her expressionless stare, it was the same in every faded, yellowed photograph. She was always there. David's stomach turned as a cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck. He forced himself to keep flipping through the pages, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. And then he found the final piece of the puzzle, a newspaper clipping from 1903. The headline made his blood run cold. The Curse of Hollow Creek, the woman who never ages. The article was short, barely a few paragraphs long, but what it described was worse than anything he had imagined. Susan Miller wasn't just a woman. She was something else, something old, something unnatural. The story told of a woman accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. The town elders, fearing her power, had attempted to burn her at the stake, but the fire never touched her. She stood in the flames, laughing, until the townspeople turned and fled, terrified. From that day on, Hollow Creek belonged to her, and the town had made a deal, a blood pact. In exchange for prosperity, wealth, crops that never failed, businesses that never struggled, they had to feed her. They had to give her an outsider, someone new, someone alone, someone like him. David's breath hitched. He slammed the book shut, nearly knocking over the stack of papers beside him. Oh God, he wasn't just being watched. He wasn't just being harassed. He was next. A sudden noise made him freeze, a soft creaking, like the sound of old wood bending under weight. David turned his head slowly, every nerve in his body on fire. The old woman at the front desk was gone. But standing in the doorway, her silhouette dark against the dim light, was Susan, and she was smiling, a slow, twisted grin that spread across her face like a crack in glass. "You shouldn't have done that, David," she whispered. The door slammed shut behind her, and then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole. David's breath caught in his throat as the sudden blackness wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud. The overhead lights had gone out so completely, so instantly, that it felt unnatural, as if something had ripped the light out of the air itself. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He could still feel her presence. Susan was still there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting. "Move, damn it!" His brain screamed, but his body refused. His legs felt like lead, every instinct inside him frozen in raw, primal terror. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, a soft click, like fingernails dragging against wood. "You should have left when you had the chance," Susan whispered from somewhere in the shadows. Her voice came from everywhere at once, above him, behind him, beside his ear. David ran. He had no direction, no plan, just the overwhelming, animalistic need to get out. His hands fumbled through the darkness, knocking over books and stacks of brittle newspaper clippings as he stumbled toward the nearest wall. A sharp pain ripped across his forearm as something cold and sharp sliced through his skin. He gasped, clutching his arm, but didn't stop moving. His foot hit something solid, a desk. He crouched, sucking in a sharp breath, forcing himself to think. His phone, his damn phone. Shoving his shaking hand into his pocket, he pulled it out. Thumb smashing against the screen. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Just an empty, lifeless screen mocking him. Susan's laughter cut through the darkness. Not human laughter, something else. It started as a soft chuckle, then grew into something distorted, inhuman, like multiple voices laughing at once. "You don't belong here," she crooned. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" David pressed his back against the desk, sweat slicking his skin. He had to get to the door, but then a flicker of light. A single candle ignited in the center of the room. The flame was small, weak, barely illuminating more than a few inches of the floor. But in its dim glow, David could see something that made his blood turn to ice. The shadows were moving, not flickering from the candlelight. Moving, shifting, writhing, and in the center of them, Susan stood completely still, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, emerging from the shifting darkness, were figures. Tall, hollow-eyed things. Their limbs too long, their faces stretched into twisted, unnatural grins. David's body screamed at him to move, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Then Susan spoke. "Don't fight it, David," she whispered. "It's easier that way." The figures lunged. David bolted. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, just ran. His body slammed against bookshelves and overturned furniture as he sprinted toward the door. Cold fingers brushed his back. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, his pulse hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered wildly, buzzing like angry wasps. David didn't stop. He ran straight through the building, bursting through the entrance and into the night air. But when he looked up, the entire town was dark, every street lamp, every window, nothing but an ocean of blackness. And from the silence, one sound rose, the distant haunting knock knock knock, right against his front gate. Waiting. David's lungs burned as he ran, his legs pumping furiously beneath him. The cold night air sliced through his skin, but it was nothing compared to the ice-cold terror coursing through his veins. His house, his supposed safe place, was still a few blocks away, but with every step he could hear them. The whispers, the knocking, and worst of all, Susan's laughter, distant but ever present, carried by the unnatural stillness of Hollow Creek. The entire town was pitch black, not a single street lamp flickered, not a single window glowed with life. It was as if the entire town had been swallowed by the same darkness that had nearly consumed him inside the archives. He wasn't just running home, he was running from Hollow Creek itself. Something in this town had changed. Or maybe something had always been wrong, and now, finally, it was letting him see. Keep moving, David. Keep moving. His heart pounded as he cut through an alley, skidding around the corner, his feet slipping against the damp pavement. As he sprinted toward his street, his eyes locked onto his house, his gate still closed, still standing tall. But there was someone standing in front of it. No, not someone. Something. At first it looked like Susan, the same thin frame, the same lifeless blue eyes, the same eerie, knowing smile. But as he got closer, he realized that her face was wrong. It wasn't a face at all. It was a mask of stretched grey skin, pulled tight over something too large, too angular. The shape of her skull was elongated, distorted, as if her bones had shifted into something that was only pretending to be human. David skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. His hands clenched into fists, every fibre of his being screaming at him to run the other way. But behind him, the whispers grew louder. Shadows stirred in the darkness, stretching toward him, crawling over the pavement like living things. He had no choice. He had to go through her. Gritting his teeth, David charged toward the gate, willing himself not to look at the thing that wore Susan's skin. He reached for the lock, his fingers shaking as they fumbled for the key. A hand grabbed his wrist. Cold, so cold, like touching something dead. His breath caught as he finally looked up. The mask of Susan tilted slightly, that smile never faltering. "Did you really think a gate would keep you safe?" she whispered. Then she lunged. David reacted on instinct. He twisted out of her grip, slamming his elbow into her chest, but instead of stumbling back, she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react, as if she hadn't even felt it. David's blood turned to ice. Then, behind her, the gate creaked open on its own. A trap. It had always been a trap. Before he could react, the whispers turned into screams. The shadows surged forward, not as mist, not as shapes, but as hands. Hundreds of them, grabbing, clawing, pulling him in. David fought, kicking, thrashing, but the cold, writhing limbs wrapped around his body like vines, dragging him backward into the gaping darkness beyond the gate, into his own home. And standing in the doorway, waiting inside, where she had always belonged, was Susan. Only this time, she didn't bother pretending to be human anymore. David's screams were swallowed by the shadows as they pulled him through the open gate into the gaping abyss of his own home. The temperature inside had dropped drastically. His breath came in ragged white puffs as he stumbled into his darkened living room, his body still tangled in the grasp of too many hands, cold, clammy fingers that coiled around his arms, his legs, his throat. They didn't feel human. They felt wrong, like something that had never been alive to begin with. The moment he was inside, the door slammed shut behind him. And then, silence. The shadows receded, slithering back into the corners of the room like living things retreating to the dark. The grip around his limbs loosened, releasing him all at once. David hit the floor hard, gasping, his heart jackhammering against his ribs, his hands clawed against the cold wood beneath him, scrambling to get his bearings. Then the whispering started again, not from outside, from inside the house. David turned his head slowly, and there she was. Susan. She stood in the doorway of his kitchen, her frame silhouetted by the faint flickering glow of a single candle. But it wasn't just her anymore. Something else stood behind her. Something that loomed tall, its limbs elongated, its shape shifting as if the very fabric of its form couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It moved in an unnatural way, jerking, twitching, stretching. David's entire body screamed, "Run!" But there was nowhere to go. Susan stepped forward. Her eyes weren't just blue anymore, they were voids, black holes stretching infinitely inward. Her mouth pulled into a grotesque grin, her lips cracking at the edges, splitting her face unnaturally wide. "You were never meant to leave," she whispered. David shoved himself backward, his hands scraping against the floor as he crawled away. Susan tilted her head. Hollow Creek doesn't let go of its own. David's back hit the wall, cold breath whispered against his ear. Not Susan, something behind him, his body locked up, ice running through his veins. He turned his head, a face inches from his own, not human, not even close. A gaping mouth stretched open wider than any jaw should allow, filled with rows of jagged teeth. It didn't make a sound. It just smiled. David screamed. He threw himself forward, his body acting on instinct, diving away from the thing behind him. His shoulder slammed against the coffee table, knocking over a lamp, sending shards of broken glass scattering across the floor. Pain shot up his arm, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Susan was still coming. So was the thing. David lunged for the door, his hands fumbling with the locks. His fingers were slick with sweat, trembling as he yanked at the deadbolt. It wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. Behind him, the whispering turned to laughter, dozens of voices laughing at once. "You don't leave, David," Susan whispered. The thing lurched toward him, and then everything went black. The final revelation. David woke up to silence, thick, suffocating silence. His head throbbed, his body ached, and when he blinked his eyes open, he found himself lying on the cold wooden floor of his living room. But something was wrong. Everything looked exactly the same. The furniture, the walls. The broken lamp still lay shattered near the coffee table. But the air was different. Too still, too hollow. Like the house was holding its breath. Slowly, David pushed himself up, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He turned his head, scanning the room, expecting to see them. Susan, the thing that had stood behind her. But they were gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was alone. Except he wasn't. The moment he moved, he felt it. The weight, the eyes watching him. David turned toward the window. Outside, the town of Hollow Creek looked normal. The streetlights were on, the sky was a dull, overcast gray. He could see the houses, the empty roads, but there was something off. Then he saw them, the people. They were standing on their porches, on the sidewalks, in the middle of the street. Dozens of them, unmoving, watching, all facing his house. His pulse pounded in his ears. Something was very, very wrong. Slowly, he backed away from the window, his hands shaking. His breath was shallow, his skin clammy with cold sweat. Then, a soft knock at the door. David's stomach dropped. Number no, no, no. Don't answer it. His instinct screamed at him, but his body was already moving, drawn toward the sound against his will. He reached the door, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Another knock. Gentle, almost polite. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. He twisted it. And then, the door swung open. The street outside was empty. No people, no movement, just the eerie glow of the streetlights and the distant sound of the wind. But there was something on his porch. A box, small, wooden, old. David stared at it, his blood running ice cold. A part of him didn't want to touch it, but a deeper part of him, the part that needed to understand, to know, forced him forward. His hands shook as he lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of photographs, faded, yellowed with age, and in every single one of them was him. David's chest seized, his vision swam. The pictures showed him living in Hollow Creek, standing by his gate, sitting on his porch, walking through the streets. But they weren't from now. The dates written on the back. 1923, 1951, 1977, 1998. They went back over 100 years. David's breath came short and shallow as he flipped through them, his mind screaming, "This isn't possible, this isn't real, I just moved here." But then he saw the last photo. It was a picture of Susan, standing in his doorway, and behind her was him. Except it wasn't. The version of him in the photo was pale, hollow-eyed, stretched into something twisted and wrong. A shadow of himself. David dropped the pictures, his entire body shaking. His hands were turning grey, his skin was fading. He looked down at his reflection in the glass window. And his face wasn't his own anymore. The last thing he heard before everything faded to black was Susan's voice, whispering in his ear, "You were never meant to leave, David. You were always part of Hollow Creek."